Welcome to Surviving Society. We are joined by Nancy and Charlie still. We're talking everything neurodiversity in the 21st century. We had planned these episodes, but in true neurodivergent style, like it's gone up, down, side to side, but that's amazing. Another example of that now being that we're going to talk about things that are a little bit more topical. So to give listeners some context, today is Monday, the 5th of August. We are just approaching a week of civil unrest in Britain or across the UK. The civil unrest broke out after 3 young girls were murdered by a 17-year-old boy in Southport. In the days that have followed, the far right have been rioting across English towns, Middlesbrough, towns and cities, I should say. Middlesbrough, Liverpool, London, Rotherham, Southport, Hartlepool, yeah. And more is supposedly planned for this week. Part of what seems like has caused this to spread so much has been a lot of misinformation around who the attacker was, what his motives were, although we don't know anything about that yet. We know who the attacker was, we don't know about his motives. But I think for many of us, this does feel like when it comes to how the far right are responding, and you can only see that these are pogroms of violence, that are targeting Muslims, black people, people of colour, religious and ethnic minorities. They're attacking asylum seekers in hotels. They are attacking lone Muslim women in hijabs, mosques. And yeah, I think that for many of us, we've seen this bubbling up for a long time. And if you can hear the deflation in my voice, the exhaustion in my voice, I think it's because, yeah, it's sad. For me, it's not, I wouldn't call it triggering. It's sad, but equally it's more like, yeah, well, this is Britain. It feels like it's been a long time coming. And actually, I was feeling like this morning and seeing you, Nancy. Nancy, you were much more full of kind of hope. And that made me feel slightly warmer inside. But equally, I still have the more kind of somber feeling that there's probably more to come.
I agree with that. I was living in the US when Trump was elected in 2016. And I had recently moved from the UK where Brexit had been voted in. I felt like some sort of harbinger of doom. Do you know, wherever Nancy goes, like, don't send me to Germany, anyone. But yeah, so I had a very reflective period after that. It was very, very, very depressing. And I spent a lot of time leaning into history. So the first thing I did after Trump was elected was join the local Black Lives Matter movement in Vermont, where I was living, and become acquainted with the works of Sojourner Truth and go back and read all of the civil rights activists' books, John Lewis's cartoon book, which is amazing. And yeah, lots and lots of that history. And I spent this weekend at Gay Pride in Brighton, where 300,000 people were welcomed by the LGBTQ community and stood up for inclusion in a very intersectional and rich way. And I've got to say, the gay community have always been way up there for me in terms of activism. You know, I remember when George Floyd was murdered in 2020, it was during Pride Month. And what happened? The gay pride flag accommodated a black and a brown stripe to show solidarity with the black and brown communities. Just immediate responsiveness, inclusion, warmth, joy, glitter, rainbows. Do you know that there's more of us than there are of them? We have done it before, we will do it again.
There we go. Like, start this off with, I started off with them all like somber, like, there's the far right, they've been here. Nancy, bringing the energy, it's good, we need it. We need it.
It sucks that we have to do it again. Yeah, it sucks that we have to do it again. But yeah, I feel like I've been preparing for moments like this for the last 8 years.
Yeah.
I saw them coming as soon as those elections happened. And, you know, we've got to remember that we've done it before and we'll do it again. But we did it before with counter-protests. In the 1930s and the 1970s in Britain, there was extreme right-wing violence and intimidation, and what happened was counter-protests. What happened was Rock Against Racism in Hackney. What happened was other people joining together, you know, the ska, punk, reggae movements of the 70s all getting together and singing and dancing their way to inclusion. And that's where I was this weekend. So it's much easier for me to feel warm this weekend because that's where I was. But I think that's the message. The message is, if we're all isolated in our rooms watching this happen as we scroll, we're going to feel terrified. If we go out and find the other people who feel the same way as us, we're going to feel emboldened and enabled and hopeful. And yeah, you know, I was listening to Billy Porter on stage. Big up Billy Porter. You know, an alumni of the ACT UP movement. You know, I lived in New York in the 90s with the gay community in New York in the 90s, and you know, we were fighting for inclusion at a point where people were dying. You know, and those people still exist. Billy Porter still exists. Billy Porter is still here to lead us in those hopeful moments where we need to be inspired. And, you know, we've done it before. We'll do it again.
I think there's something also, you know, this is a social science podcast, and what we know as social scientists is that riots come when the weather is hot, and we've had quite a long spell now of hot weather in the mid-20s at high 20s. We also know that it tends to come when people are feeling frustrated. So there's been a lot of unrest. We've had a change of government in this country that we're all pinning our hopes on. But there's almost something about just falling over the finish line, what has been one of the most horrific Tory governments of memory. And people are feeling forgotten. They're feeling broke. You know, we've seen just the most basic things of shoplifting is at the highest level it's been for years because people just can't afford to live. So what we see is a kind of opportunism that comes, and some politicians also jumping on that bandwagon. And what that does is it forces a unification of people who grab anything to unite by. And in this case, it's right-wing fascists who are opportunistically taking some very angry and upset people and giving them a reason to riot, and it's creating large groups of people standing in the name of fascism who might not consider themselves to be fascist, and this is the outcome. And we have to see what that is, and it'll be interesting to see now what the new Labour government's going to do about it. And it's concerning because of the sheer number of people and the misinformation that's going about with that. We were just talking about just before we started recording, actually, people already talking about how, you know, some of the people who are protesting and rioting, they're not actually right-wing, they're not actually standing in the name of fascism at all, but they do need to protest for their rights. And it is highly problematic that we have immigrants in this country. And you just have to say, hang on a minute. And it's a worrying time. It's, like you say, it's not surprising that this is happening. And I'm really hoping that there's a Cobra meeting this morning, actually. It'll be interesting to see what the response is. But the most alarming thing for me is the misinformation. And, you know, we've just heard this, I just heard this morning, actually, that the misinformation is potentially coming from Russia.
Social media has been an accelerant to feelings that have long been harboured within human populations. I mean, I think it's around a third of humans have an authoritarian tendency. Genetically, they have an authoritarian tendency, which gets activated in times of scarcity. And generally speaking, human beings seek strong, decisive leadership in times of change and uncertainty. So we just need to make love the loudest voice. I mean, I'm hearing what you're saying about large numbers of people across the UK. I think the issue this weekend was disorganisation. So you had much, much, much larger numbers showing up for gay pride. You had 10,000 anti-racist punks in Blackpool. We just weren't distributed where we needed to be. But the numbers have always been on the side of inclusion. And I think bringing this back to neurodiversity, neurodivergent people are known for our commitment to justice. We're known for feeling an intensity of sensitivity when it comes to unfairness and injustice. And I see the neurodiversity community being incredibly active in these next few years as we need to stand up and be counted, as it is our generation's turn to form the counter protests. I think the neurodiversity movement will stand strong on the side of anti-racism, on the side of inclusion for LGBTQ rights. And interestingly, do you know 30% of transgender people are autistic?
Interesting.
Compared to 2% in the general population.
Interesting. That's very interesting.
It's cross-sectional.
You've both said so much there. There's so much that I want to talk about and hone in on. But just for the context of, the far right riots, I think that the idea that most people are on the side of inclusion, I probably would have to disagree with you on there, Nancy. I think that people have got it in them to be loving and understanding and accepting. But if it enters their back garden and they don't like it and they're scared of it and it's affecting their kids, or it's perceived to be affecting their kids or their family or their resources, I think it's much more difficult to get those on the side of inclusion. However, we also need to look at this in terms of the messy concoction of a long history of British fascism and ideas of white nativism, incel culture, the manosphere, Gamergate, right-wing politicians, but also left-wing politicians, like politicians in general. There is money, there is capital and money to be made in the spreading of hate and racism and xenophobia and Islamophobia. Like, that's the issue that we've got now. We're in a society where capitalism is really linked to the growth of these kind of cultures. So I think that you've got this kind of more macro side of things. Then you've got the more micro where, like, a lot of us know people that know of people that agree with some of these people or fascists or rioters. And, like, I don't know, for me, it's just interesting because we can't, for me going forwards, we can't separate ourselves from them. They are part of us. So what do we do with that? And I don't have the answers, but another point, which I think is a cause for concern for those of us that are interested in fighting for the rights of the neurodiversity community, is how, when it comes to these kind of tragedies, these kind of violences, how neurodiversity becomes labelled and named. So, for example, the boy who committed these atrocities, we now know that he has an autism diagnosis. We were talking before this, we recorded this podcast about some of the lone school shooters having their autism diagnosis, and then the way autism then becomes pathologised and misunderstood within the media, within our everyday lives. So there's so much, it's a mess really, isn't it? But I think that there is a lot for people like yourselves and myself as well to kind of intervene on, like, have you thought about this or have you thought about that? And sometimes that can be missing in these heightened times of...
I mean, the question is it the autism that creates that propensity towards violence, or is it the lack of care and the vulnerability that an autistic person experiences? Yeah. Because autism isn't the only way to be vulnerable in society. You're vulnerable if you've been in foster care. You're vulnerable if you've had traumatic experiences. You're vulnerable if you've been neglected and very, very...
Yes.
And living without resources and poverty and homelessness. So, you know, autism it's not the case that all autistic people end up doing these things, and it's not the case that all people who do these things are autistic. What is the consistent thing that goes across the events, the things that lead up to events like this, is a lack of care, is a lack of community cohesion, is a lack of love and support and resources. And that's consistent. That is a very consistent thing. So I just don't think it's helpful to focus on the autistic diagnosis. What's helpful is to focus on what are the things that we can still control.
Yeah.
What are the things that we can do something about as a society, as a community, and to work on those.
Just getting back to your point about capitalism, you know, we've now seen this rise in populism of our politicians, and fairly recently we know now that Kamala Harris is going to be running in America, and I know that all the people I know are rooting for that. But if you look at the way now game show hosts and television presenters are becoming people in charge of countries, and it's to do with the way you can monopolise social media and the narrative you create, then yeah, it is alarming, and it's much more extreme. You are either one thing or you are the other, and you have to, nail your flag to the mast.
I mean, I think one thing that is good about right now is that a Labour government are much more likely to legislate against private companies purveying social media misinformation than a Tory government were.
Well, let's see.
I mean, we're going to have to influence and we're going to have to work for that. But yeah, let's see. But it's more likely than it would have been under the previous government. And I want at least one country to do this properly, to put back the fairness doctrine somehow in the way that information is reported and shared. And then watch that one country calm down, and then the other
everyone calm down,
and then all the other countries will go, oh look, see what they did there, they fixed it, oh let's do that.
But misinformation has always been such a huge part of how we consume media. Like, I don't think we have a time where those in charge of distributing, let's say, newspapers, pamphlets, have ever necessarily done so through a fairness and equality lens. It's
a great point. I don't think there's ever been so much money invested in misinformation before.
Yeah.
And the amount of AI and deep fakes that are now in the media makes it harder and harder to spot what's true and what's not.
It's like the rumblings that have always been there are now on steroids. So we need to take the steroids out of it so that people can have a chance of consuming their media in a fairer way.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think you're right about it being on steroids. I think when we talk about misinformation, the media and social media, I think obviously all of us in this room remember a time before social media, and during that time there was still misinformation. If we look at the Murdoch empire, you're right, it's just kind of on steroids now, but it's part of the same culture that keeps those in power. But the lower classes attacking each other.
Quite agree. And I think that the thing that you mentioned earlier about the manosphere and the incel culture, that's my worry for the young people.
Yes,
because the young people could potentially be very advantageous in this change, because young people who've grown up around social media have had to develop better critical thinking skills.
Have they though?
Well, exactly. Have they though? And will they though?
Yeah.
And can they though?
Yeah.
Do you know? So, I mean, I've heard my own children who are little Gen Zers, say things like, oh, where'd you hear that? Was it YouTube? Check your sources, bro. Oh. And I've heard this kind of, so I know those things exist in young people.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I love that.
They and I also read a study where actually it's boomers who are more likely to be persuaded by social media.
Yeah. Don't get me wrong.
It's basically with the boomers, as long as it's well produced, they think it's reliable. It's the level of production. If they see a good level of production, they assume the information is good.
Face validity,
absolutely.
Face validity.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
But young people are less likely to be convinced by face validity. But then the wedge that I do see with the young people is, as you say, that the gender differences now and the biological essentialism, biological determinism is rife, isn't it? That's what's behind all the transphobia.
Yeah.
Basic biological determinism.
Yeah.
Very topical because we're in the middle of the Paris Olympics at the moment.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that's something that I want to draw attention to, actually, is that while this is going on, we are having an absolute assault on the transgender community again from every area of politics. And, that is just rumbling along, and it's absolutely devastating for the neurodivergent community, because there is just such a higher representation of transgender in the neurodivergent community, and we're really struggling with that. Yeah,
no, I think the convergence between far right, internet culture, manosphere, the right wing, far right media, podcasters, and transphobia existing, and anti-blackness, Islamophobia, it all just creates this messy concoction of politics, which makes a minority of people a lot of money.
It does.
which is always kind of like my overarching kind of politics and concern. But more recently, I've been trying to talk to more people that we all broadly agree on most things about incel culture and about young men and boys. And it's not to say that girls and women or non-binary people don't engage in these kind of cultures, but it's more to, I see a lot of men that are of a particular background taking up this space and talking about these groups and what's happening. And like, I feel like they're missing the point. But I also feel like those of us on this side of things are ignoring it because it's messy and there's loads of other people that need our support and help as well. But I'm really motivated by other like historical figures that are still alive today, like Stella Datsy, for example. She did a lot of work in the 90s looking at how we can re-educate young, white, predominantly working class youth in the East End to make them not be racist, basically. And it's like, I'm really drawn to this at the moment because I think that's also what's going on right now. Looking at the scenes from the riots or seeing the scenes from the far right riots, it's a lot of young people. It's a lot of young people being the foot soldiers of those that are making a lot of money, being the foot soldiers of their work, and they're the ones whose lives are going to be ruined by these riots. The people that are making money from spreading misinformation, their lives aren't going to be ruined. They'll just go again.
That's true.
That's a really strong point.
People have always joined gangs for identity, you know, since the dawn of time, young people. And it is about belonging, it is about identity, and it gives you a lot to be part of something and to feel part of a movement.
And the logic running under all of these things is the biological determinism logic. That is still a compelling argument that people will fall for, that your biology is your destiny, that the skin you're born in, this gender you're born in, the neurotype that you're born in will determine your outcomes in life. And that, that has been fundamentally the underpinning philosophy of eugenics, of so many things, that we've railed against. And it still operates as a compelling argument. I had I've got twin sons, and one of them started to skirt a little bit close to Andrew Tate at one point. And I had some very, very long conversations with him. And one of the things he was talking to me about was testosterone. And he said, well, testosterone makes you different as a person. It does this, da, 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 da. And I said, if that was true, then it would be a straightforward relationship, wouldn't it? The men with the most testosterone would perpetuate the most harm and the most violence. And that's not true, is it?
That's such a good point. I need to write that down. That's such a good counterpoint.
Okay, it's recorded on the podcast.
Yeah, that's such a good counterpoint.
And I said, the more testosterone you have, the more likely you are to be bald. And your father is 6'5" and bald, so he's probably got more testosterone than most men you know. But is he the most violent man you know, or is he in fact the most gentle, sharing, wonderful father you've ever met? And he went, actually, no, he is. You're right, Mum. He is. And I was like, yeah. So testosterone doesn't predetermine your behaviour. So
how long did it take you to get him away from skirting from Andrew Tate?
It took lots of little conversations like that
over time.
What did I make him watch? I made him watch something as well.
To be fair to him as well, the way it started was to do with algorithms. He wasn't looking for this information.
No, my son and I are really into F1. We've actually just been I drove him to the Belgian Grand Prix for his 18th birthday present, and back again. We had a great time. But yeah, we're both really into Formula One, and it was from watching having Formula One things on his socials, looking at cars, to then looking at Bugattis, to then he gets Andrew Tate. I know, it's horrific. Yeah, that's how quick it was. Yeah. I know. And it was really subtle. And it was just little things like, yeah, but Mum, he hasn't actually been convicted of anything, has he? I'm like, okay, we're going to have some conversations. But yeah, lots and lots of little conversations. And I made him, I can't remember what film I made him watch, but it was like a documentary about embedded misogyny in media.
Okay.
So that he could kind of start reframing stuff like that.
I think what alarmed me the most about that situation is I know your kids a little bit and they're open.
Well, you diagnosed that one with ADHD.
He hasn't given me permission to discuss that.
I haven't named him.
Both of them are used to sitting at the table and having conversations with their parents that open their mind, and everything can be discussed. And it blew my mind that if they can fall foul of algorithms, then no one is safe.
Well, I told everybody, didn't I? I messaged everyone I knew, and I said, listen, this has just happened in my family. If this can happen in my family, it can happen in your family. And that reminds me of what you and I were talking about earlier, which is actually the work of allyship happens in your own community. And that's the thing that I've really want to lean into with all of this that's gone on lately, is what am I doing in my family, with my friends, with the people I know? Who can I get to come to counter protest with me? Who's got the capacity to come to counter protest with me? The people who can't physically do that because of disability or neurodivergent overwhelm, where can I signpost them so that they can still feel active and participatory in creating the community cohesion that we're looking for? It is about our own, it's about looking in the mirror, isn't it? And it's about looking at the people around us and going, what can we do together?
What does all of this mean, do you think, for the neurodiversity community? Because obviously it's such a broad, it's really for people, isn't it? What does this mean for people? But we're talking about neurodiversity on this podcast. I guess my fears around incel culture, the manosphere, young people, I am often at times thinking about those that find social identification or an understanding of self a little bit more complex, those that are more structurally marginalised, those that are not traditionally accepted within mainstream education and family setups. Like, who is their community? Where are they finding solace? And I feel like there could be some,
I think that's a really lovely point, actually, but I think that's where the neurodiversity community does need to step in, because we need to be the alternative community for those people.
And again, neurodiversity is cross-sectional.
Yeah.
So that neurominorities will appear in all of our social groups. And you're right. I think what's going on for me is, yes, we're more vulnerable, but I also think we can be more vocal. And so, I can think of strong young men maybe in some of these groups that are getting the wrong messages and are then more vocal with those messages. So, there's work to be done to pull our own into line, of course.
Yeah, and I think actually the neurodiversity community is quite powerful and quite strong.
And sometimes even stroppy.
Yeah, we might be known for our stroppiness actually sometimes. So I think there's work to be done in our community there for sure. Absolutely, there's work to be done in our community there.
What does that work look like? De-radicalisation work, I guess. What does that look like for us?
Wow, well, in your case, it was directly contacting all parents in your orbit and saying and sending them the actual materials, wasn't it, for them to look at and view and be aware of. And it was very well received from what you said at the time.
It was. But in terms of creating love for and community within neurodiversity, so that young neurodivergent men don't feel that the incel culture is the only community available to them, I think that, well, it is a very online space. What I can't speak to is the gaming side of it, because that will be big. What happens in the gaming community will be a big draw for young neurodivergent men. And I have never played a video game in my life.
Oh, Nancy.
I know. Not once. I know.
That's a bit weird.
As an ADHDer,
I've never done it.
Game.
The closest I've ever got is when I used to have a Nokia 6310. I used to play Snake a lot.
Were you good at Snake?
Yeah, I was great at it. What are you talking about?
There you go. You're a natural born gamer.
Snake and Sudoku was as close as I got. So I think that's big. But there's a huge amount of activism in the neurodivergent community.
Yeah.
People are right on.
Yes.
But where I think people can be a little bit too right on, it's a little bit performative.
Say more.
It can be a little bit performative, a little bit high horsey, a little bit self-righteous.
Yes.
And a lack of nuance. Do you know, there's this kind of extreme thinking, things are all good or all bad, and there's sometimes hard, what the neurodiversity community sometimes find hard is the grey areas in between, where we're trying to establish that people are neither 100% good or 100% bad, and good people do bad things and bad people can do good things, and that, you know, an election isn't a referendum on one issue. And, you know, those sorts of conversations can be quite difficult to have in the neurodiversity community. That's one of the roles that I have taken for myself.
Well, quite, I was going to say, only a small number of people can actually equivalent go, shush now, right? Because it doesn't go down well.
It doesn't go down well, and it's hard.
You have taken a lot of flack. I have taken less flack. But when I've actually waded in on someone who is saying, ADHD is this, that and the other, and this is what we need to do. And I've gone, that's not quite right, actually, and you're spoiling it. Stop it. And actually, you know, other people outside of that community can't do it. And again, this is when we go into workplaces and organisations, and people are kind of pussyfooting around, I don't know what to do about this employee. They need people like us to go in and say, this is what you need to do, this is what you need to say. And this, I guess you'd say it's kind of not self-policing. We are quite good at self-policing as a group of people, but we don't want it to be too policed.
Yeah.
You know, how do you do that?
We need to create spaces for people to do more self-development work. You know, it's a trajectory, isn't it? You know, when your experience has been exclusion, and then the first thing that happens is you find a community and your experience is inclusion, you have this kind of very ricocheting emotional response to, you know, I've spent my whole life feeling like I was in the wrong. Actually, it turns out I've just got this unusual neurotype, so now I'm 100% in the right, and I feel very kind of resentful and a bit bitter, and we've got to just support people through that journey.
I definitely went through that journey, and even when you were talking about like the grey area, the need for us to embrace the grey areas, but also like people aren't 100% good, aren't 100% bad, like I definitely have to kind of unlearn those things almost like on a day-to-day basis and really think before I speak.
I love that. We all have to think before we speak.
I know it sounds so basic, but like I really have had to unlearn some of those more kind of binarized views of people and things.
I think there's a real irony about us calling out capitalism and the monetisation of neurodiversity. You know, actually, this is my profession.
Mic drop, Charlie. There's money to be made in neurodiversity.
There is money to be made in neurodiversity. I am that white middle-class diagnosing specialist, and sit here on mic going, you don't need a diagnosis. But actually, it turns out it was pretty handy for me.
Yeah.
And so it's a bit rich, excuse the pun, for me to call out people who are monetising their neurotype because it may be the only way they can see to make any money. But it's from those more extreme parts of our community that they want, for clickbait reasons, to say things that we then need to pull them into check, that we also find it can be highly problematic and not good for the community as a whole when we're seeing clickbait stuff pushed through. But this is an uncomfortable truth that we make money from this.
We do. I mean, I've really done a lot of personal work on that, and you know, I've really tried to set up Genius Within in a way that it isn't actually playing to those capitalist, to the exploitativeness of capitalism. You know, like having a company that is a community interest company where we have to legally we have made ourselves obliged to reinvest 65% of our profits in our community each year, which we do through our Blooming Genius subsidiary, which distributes money to grassroots organisations for young neurodivergent people, where I've created an employee shareholder scheme. You know, really tried to think about how do I make this generative and as inclusive as possible. And I tell you what, Chantel, it's not easy.
No,
it's not
easy to. They make it hard to distribute resources.
Yeah, they do. It is hard. Yeah, and I'm not sure who they are, but the system.
They are they. Babylon.
They need to
Babylon.
Stop it.
But yeah, it's really, well, it's a funny thing, isn't it? Because, you know, I used to be the underdog. I used to be the outsider. I used to be the David, not the Goliath. And one of the things that happened to me when neurodiversity got popular is that my company grew quite big. Yeah. And I've got 200 associates and 50 employees. And I realised at one point in the online community that I was no longer David, that I was the Goliath. And I was like, oh, that's an interesting space. You know, and what people see from the outside of me now is that I'm the establishment.
Yeah.
You know, because I got into this neurodiversity work 22 years ago. And I've, you know, so am I the establishment of neurodiversity? It's given me a really interesting insight about intention. You know, my intentions have always been positive. They've always been inclusive. But, you know, have I created exclusion as part of that sometimes? Yes, I absolutely have, through my own lack of self-development and my own lack of self-awareness. You know, those things that we've started doing to increase representation in our staff team, you know, those have been happening for 4 or 5 years. Then they weren't.
I was going to say,
they weren't there from the beginning.
I've seen you learn how to demonstrate your integrity.
Yeah,
it's a bit like your driving test. You have to grossly exaggerate, mirror signal manoeuvre, then the examiner knows that you're doing it. And actually, you've learnt as an organisation to shout a bit more about the good work that you do.
Yeah, we have.
Because it was just happening on the quiet.
It was, yeah. Yeah, but it was happening on the quiet because I've got this really weird embedded Christian thing from part of my upbringing, which is like, you know, you don't shout about it. It's between you and God rather than it's, you know, for the general public.
It's between you and God.
Yeah, I know. Look, listen, I can't help these things that were raised and they're just in my head. But yeah, so anyway, that is a different thing that has changed. Is more about the kind of role modelling of it. But yeah, we do make money out of this. We do. But do we make money out of it, or are we earning a good living?
And this is the point. Everyone deserves to have the chance to live an ordinary and dignified life from birth. The right to love, live, embrace your passions. Your passion is neurodiversity and taking people on that journey, and you've managed to make a living out of it. That's something to be proud of.
And when I think about what we charge, I also think about young women.
Yeah.
I think about what message am I sending to young women if I work for free?
Oh, God, yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
What message am I sending to the next generation if I don't charge appropriately for my time? That's how I have to think about it.
Have we invoiced for this podcast? What we're getting paid for?
On that, is Charlie Gunn? I was going to say, I should be the sponsor of this podcast.
Yeah. Before we end, some notes on hope. Charlie?
What, just any hope about anything?
Yeah.
I'm hopeful. Does that count?
You're always hopeful. You're an absolutely dyed-in-the-wool optimist.
Come on.
Are you?
Yeah,
oh, that's beautiful.
It's important, isn't it? You know, because you can make stuff happen, right?
Yeah. Charlie's little phrase that she always says to me whenever I'm feeling on a downer about anything, she says, Nancy, where did it all go right? Darling, where did it all go right? Look at all the things we've achieved. Where did it all go right? She's a real cheerleader.
I love that. Where did it all go right?
She's such a cheerleader.
Brilliant. Okay, you're just generally hopeful. We'll take that.
Always in connecting with your tribe, connecting with the people that are with you, that want to do the same things as you. You know, Neurotribes was a book that Steve Silberman wrote that really brought a focus and a sense of community to the neurodiversity community. So yeah, my hope is in the fact that I'm not alone, and that there's lots of people who want this current paradigm shift that we're in as a species to end in a way that allows all of us to just live our best quiet lives in love and in hope and in enough resources. And I think there are a lot of us that are like this. I hear your point about, you know, it's easy to activate the opposite response. But I think, you know, history tells us that every time we have these big fights, it goes one way. It might take a while, but it does tend to go.
And ultimately, we're hopeful that we'll be out of a job one day because we won't need to do it anymore.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, that's what
That's a great note on a hope. Thank you so much, Nancy and Charlie. Thank you, listeners. That was brilliant.
Thank you for listening to Surviving Society.
To support our work, you can rate,
review and subscribe. To host or produce a series of Surviving Society,
get in touch with us via Twitter or Instagram.